Let's go ahead and talk about EDM and the arrival of EDM on the scene. Now, I mentioned here, as well as in the email, that I sort of have a personal connection, which was that I remember going through these years of sort of the late 90s into the 2000s. Most of what, at least the music I was listening to, was very rock or metal influenced, like progressive metal, new metal. There was the sort of alt rock of Nirvana and the like, so as well as some of the softer rock that was coming out, like Coldplay. So that was in the context in which EDM first started to arise. And in this context, that focused very much more on live sound and acoustic instruments, EDM really felt like a splash of cold water, something completely new and different. And for someone who identifies as a musician and was learning to play instruments, I and many people in my situation, in my shoes, felt like EDM represented an attack on all sorts of live played music and what most popular music genres were at that time. So the success of EDM really felt like this wave that threatened to eradicate popular music as we knew it and sort of turn everything digital, so where there would no longer be any live performance, whether vocals or instrumental, at all. Now, I mentioned in an email that from 2023, looking back, that opinion seems a bit passé, but again, that's how it felt at the time. Just like it felt for my colleague in the music department, like the Bee Gees playing over the radio was a big attack on rock music. And so we see these sort of patterns playing out over and over again. And so when EDM, just like disco, first started to bubble up more in the mainstream in the 2000s, there was a lot of people like me who had pushed back against it, maybe who wanted music to sort of stay centered on, the electric guitars and the four-piece band and rock and roll and the like. But now to go to the history here of EDM, as we've noted, it has its roots in the 1970s disco clubs, in Giorgio Moroder and Donna Summers. Then in the 1980s, as disco gets forced back underground, we see some of its artifacts, like the synthesizer and the drum machine, especially the 808 drum machine, live on in pop through Madonna, through Michael Jackson, as well as in early hip-hop that starts to bubble up as well in the late 80s. And in the 1990s, you start to see the flourishing of other electronically influenced genres, things like techno, dub, house, and trance. In other words, the disco music that had been pushed underground started to sort of percolate and reform and evolve into new musical forms that, again, were focused in the clubs and focused on dancing. Then eventually it moved back into the mainstream, especially in Europe, and then came back to the United States as EDM. Now, in 1998, Madonna released an album, Ray of Light, that was really impactful in mainstreaming EDM, as Madonna, who is no stranger into using more of these electronic elements, sort of put forth her first purely EDM pop album. So that was something that really helped to give it some mainstream attention. Then in the 2000s, DJs like Tiesto, who we'll be looking at, Skrillex, Daft Punk, Deadmau5, and more, started achieving these top chart-topping success with various tracks. Now, EDM as a genre is interesting because EDM is basically just an umbrella term. Electronic dance music. What does that describe musically, right? It's just anything that's using electronics and centered around sort of a vibe for dancing. So because of that, the subgenres are really necessary to sort of give it more musical characteristics. But it produces these subgenres incredibly rapidly, sometimes just in the span of a few years. We've already talked about house, techno, trance, there's dubstep, drum and bass, garage, grime, trap, hardstyle, there's acid, moombahton, juke, breakbeat, downtempo, reggaeton, vaporwave, lo-fi these days. And again, I could just go on and on with these various subgenres. There's more subgenres being made even at the present than one can keep up with. So EDM is just sort of this broader umbrella term, the way that popular music or even rock music usually is. Then finally, just some remarks on the music of EDM. So what I found interesting and in a lot of ways threatening back in 2000s me shoes was that musically EDM started to shift a lot of the emphasis on what we valued in popular music. For one thing, it started to shift the emphasis away from purely vocals, which now I find quite interesting, but at the time maybe felt more threatening. EDM songs didn't necessarily always have either prominent vocal tracks, like just a song that follows lyrics, or it used them in interesting ways, sort of like as samples or snippets, almost in an instrumental way, rather than just focusing on the vocal artist. It also featured new experimental forms, and here I do have to mention the dubstep bass. Having, that transition of the dubstep bass drop when the bass drops, that was sort of something new that was being introduced. And, having the form of the song that's like the build up to the bass drop, and then what happens after the bass drop, that was a new thing. It wasn't just verse, chorus, bridge, and so on, those sort of more defined modules. Also, as we've mentioned previously with disco, EDM started to move more towards these long-form tracks, and you'll see this in the Spotify playlist. Instead of just these sort of 3 to 4 minute pop-influenced verse-chorus type of songs, you start to see more experiment with long-form play, things that are 6 minutes and 7 minutes and beyond. And the reason is because the purpose is just to create an appropriate mood or vibe or atmosphere in which to dance. And so if you just do it, with quickly changing modules that follows a trajectory and lands the plane, and it's about 3.5 minutes for radio play, well, that maybe doesn't fit the purpose quite so well, because the purpose is to help people to dance over longer periods of time. And of course, live DJs can spin these tracks out even longer and even longer and even longer. It doesn't have to be just limited to what we listen to on Spotify. Okay, and then finally, for EDM, the prevalence of introducing these synthesized timbres continues to persist today in genres like pop, what we know as electro-pop, or sort of digitally produced pop music, rather than just recording live play in a studio. Rap, of course, the 808 drum machine we've already mentioned, but also the practice of sampling and so many other things that synthesized instruments are used in, and hip-hop more generally. So these are all genres that are very heavily informed by the advancements that were made in EDM. Now let's talk about some early artists, and here I specifically want to highlight two: Yellow Magic Orchestra in Japan and Kraftwerk in Germany. Now I mentioned that disco was pushed underground in the United States mostly because of the backlash against the LGBTQ community. So as a result, the music also was pushed underground and made less visible, especially on the radio. Well, in Europe, that never really was the case, or elsewhere in the world. The sound of disco continued to be very impactful and influential, but there weren't the same social reasons for sort of having a backlash against the music. And so you saw artists like Yellow Magic Orchestra and Kraftwerk just taking the ideas that they heard from early disco and iterating on it. So let's start with Yellow Magic Orchestra here. The sort of front person and lead composer for Yellow Magic Orchestra is Ryuichi Sakamoto, and he was really on the cutting edge of music technology at the time. First of all, he was an early adopter of the Roland TR-808 rhythm composer or drum machine, which he used in his song A Thousand Knives from 1980. Now, if you are familiar with the history maybe of early hip-hop, this is a very early adoption of the 808. So the sound of Yellow Magic Orchestra and Thousand Knives in particular started to introduce the sounds of 808 beats into the musical stream. It wasn't something that was already going on. It was highly influential, and in fact, this song and other Yellow Magic Orchestra tracks would become frequently sampled by hip-hop and rap artists. Now, in general, the music of Yellow Magic Orchestra explores these themes of humanity and the mechanical becoming one, human and machine. And this was actually thematically played out by Sakamoto in the computer-assisted composition through the Roland MC8 microcomposer sequencer. In other words, you could put a certain grouping of pitches into the sequencer, and the sequencer would arpeggiate it in different ways that was not purely predetermined by the human. The computer had sort of some agency in writing the music. They also were known for incorporating early video game aesthetics, representing a lot of the industry coming out of Japan at the time, such as in their track Computer Game. And next to Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk is another artist I could just spend, several slides, a whole presentation talking about. But in a quick summary, Kraftwerk also joined into promoting this human-machine theme, thematic imagery, these human-machine metaphor, by having this very uniform look, 4 people, all with similar haircuts and similar outfits, standing in a row, and just hitting samples and triggering certain sounds on their laptops as part of live performance. In other words, the live performance aspect was very stripped back to just sort of present this almost mechanical factory type look. And in general, their form also followed this aesthetic. It was very minimalist, with these repeating electronic cells or additive layers that would start to add in one piece and add in another piece until it built on itself. So one example of this is their famous track Autobahn, which is again long-form, 24-minute long track that is meant to capture the mentality of driving on the highway, seeing sort of repetitive elements with new ones introduced, and having music that would have the momentum to propel you driving down the highway, and not necessarily have to change all the time. Now, like Yellow Magic Orchestra, Kraftwerk is extremely influential in the formation of early hip-hop, in being one of the most sampled artists of all time. And because Kraftwerk usually didn't rarely incorporated vocals, it was very easy for early hip-hop artists to sample and sort of take a beat, take a lick, and incorporate it into their own tracks. So Kraftwerk is very influential to the sound of early hip-hop. Also, they innovated further in how they presented their music live by introducing three-dimensional 3D concerts in the 2010s, which they've continued touring with to this day.